Bonjour tout le monde. Thanks for joining us online. My name's Michelle McMaster, and I'm Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation's Affordable Housing Consultant for Toronto, and that's where we're broadcasting from. I'm joined here by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, which includes Housing and Urban Affairs, Mr. Adam Vaughan. Adam, it's a pleasure to have you here. And also Michel Tremblay, Senior Vice President at Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Now we're on the cusp of launching the National Housing Strategy for Canada, the government's initiative, and CMHC, the agency that will deliver this.
Et aujourd'hui, nous sommes très heureux d'être ici afin d'annoncer une étape importante
de la Stratégie Nationale sur le Logement. But before we start, I'd like to inform those of you watching us that we're happy to take your questions in English or in French through Facebook Live. Just fill in a question on the comments screen and we'll take your questions in just a few minutes. But first, Adam, la parole est à vous.
Merci. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about what I think is one of the most important parts of the National Housing Strategy, which is the human rights-based framework that we're going to use to pursue and deliver this critical piece of policy. What's important about housing and about the National Housing Strategy and the consultations which we'll now be engaged in is that we've switched housing from simply being a goal, as something to build or something to provide Canadians, but we're taking a look at it as a tool to actually realize people's social, economic and environmental rights, to understand how housing can be used to tackle poverty, to reduce homelessness. And in doing so, we I think have taken an historic step, not just in producing the National Housing Strategy and funding it to the tune of $40 billion, but it's this notion of a rights-based framework as a way of realizing people's basic rights through making sure that they have access to a strong housing system that builds the housing they need, where they need it, at an affordable rate. And I think that what we're looking for from Canadians from coast to coast to coast is how to realize and operationalize this human rights-based framework as we move towards achieving better housing standards for all Canadians.
Thank you. Michel, avez-vous quelque chose à ajouter en français peut-être?
Oui, certainement. Une approche du logement, je crois, axée sur les droits de la personne, comme Adam mentionne, c'est important pour réaliser la vision de la Stratégie nationale sur le logement. Suite aux consultations que M. Vaughan vient d'annoncer, le gouvernement déposera un projet de loi qui sera important pour promouvoir ce droit. Je pense que la législation qu'on déposera exigera que les gouvernements futurs maintiennent une stratégie nationale sur le logement et que cette stratégie continue d'être axée sur les Canadiens qui sont les plus vulnérables en matière de logement. Donc, c'est une initiative très importante, je crois.
Excellent, merci. Okay, we've now got a chance to take some questions from members of the audience. Veronica is wondering what a human rights-based approach to housing means. Adam, can you tackle that one first? Because this is something interesting. I mean, we hear a lot about the importance of housing, the need for housing, and certainly in our daily work at CMHC, that's important. But what does this mean, well, human rights-based?
Basic human rights are protected through the Charter, but to fully realize those human rights, it's almost impossible to do it without housing. And so it's not so much about a right to housing, because the right to housing doesn't necessarily give you the right housing. There are a lot of vacant houses in Canada. Simply moving people into them doesn't put them close to work or school, doesn't put them close to family. Putting people in the wrong housing, think of people with disabilities, may get them shelter, but may not give them a quality of life that they're entitled to. So the best way to realize people's full human rights is to make sure, as the United Nations Convention on Social Development shows us, is that there's access to a housing system and a housing system that's there to meet their needs. And so the rights-based approach to housing is to say, look at, people have human rights, housing is an integral part of that, and to realize those full social, economic, cultural, and environmental rights, you need to have a system of shelter that's available to Canadians, either through private means or public means, or a combination of the two. And so it's a way of understanding the humanity of the system, but at the same time understanding that the system has to be flexible, it has to be dynamic, and has to be long-term in its composition, so that it's not just there for this year, but as we've said in the proposed strategy, that it's on a 10-year renewal cycle and it moves forward beyond just the simple 10 years we've proposed and funded in the budgets.
So it becomes enshrined.
It becomes in the same way that healthcare is sort of locked into the federal, provincial, territorial, territorial dialogue in the same way that healthcare is delivered by all orders of government, not just the federal government, in the same way that healthcare is present in our lives as a way of realizing our full human rights. Housing needs to be a component of that as well. And so it builds it into an existing structure of rights as opposed to a new add-on to the Constitution or the Charter.
Okay. That's very interesting. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. Michel, pourriez-vous préciser un peu en français, c'est quoi cette approche du logement axée sur les droits de la personne?
Oui, certainement. Donc, comme Adam a mentionné, la stratégie nationale sur le logement en soi est un gros pas vers l'avant, vers ça, parce qu'on a maintenant, le gouvernement a maintenant une vision à long terme pour le logement. Qu'est-ce que le logement, avec des objectifs, on s'est fixé des objectifs, donc on doit rendre compte au Parlement et aux Canadiens, voir si on rencontre ces objectifs. Et c'est aussi basé sur 4 principes fondamentaux. Donc, je mentionne la reddition de comptes, donc la responsabilisation en est une, mais c'est aussi une approche plus participative, une inclusion et un accent sur la non-discrimination. Donc, pour que tous les Canadiens aient la chance d'avoir des logements abordables qui rencontrent leurs besoins.
Excellent, merci. Et cette idée de la participation, c'est un bon lien à notre première question. We've got a question here. Who can provide their feedback on a human rights-based approach to housing? So, Adam, do you want to take a stab at that first of all?
It's all of our rights, so all of us have a role to play in enunciating what we think it should mean, can mean, and could mean. So, in particular, people with lived experience, people who have either lived in shelters or lived rough on streets or have come through housing systems that have failed them. Those perspectives are critical because those people are the ones whose basic human rights are not being met by the current system the way it's constructed. But we also know that tenants in rental buildings, we know that people that live in communities that are experiencing economic change or climate change dynamics, their ability to live where they want to live, to live in the kind of shelter they require, are being challenged by a lot of different dimensions. So we need to hear the perspectives from communities right across the country, from the north, from the south, from urban areas, rural areas. We need to hear from the different economic stratas that exist in our country, and in particular, as I said, people with lived experience. And we need to hear from local government officials because while we fund a housing system, we know that the other orders of government, provincial and municipal, as well as Indigenous governments, deliver housing in a real sort of person-to-person way, and how they understand this framework is as critical to the federal government's perspective. So there is no voice we don't want to hear from, and there is no perspective that isn't going to make this a better policy if we do hear from them.
Oh, that's fantastic. So we're just entering the period of consultation. Just as you've made the announcement now about the consultation happening, and then the communiqué de presse has gone out, and so it's official. So, Michel, avez-vous des commentaires à ajouter?
Non, je pense qu'Adam, dans sa réponse, on veut entendre les voix de tout le monde. Donc, c'est important. Je pense qu'on a appris à travers le développement de la stratégie nationale sur le logement l'importance de la participation, des communications. On a fait comme tu le sais, Michel, des consultations exhaustives pendant la période de développement de la stratégie nationale sur le logement. Et on a aussi appris par l'entremise des Canadiens que l'importance, les Canadiens veulent vraiment qu'on focus sur les personnes au Canada qui sont le plus vulnérables. Donc, c'est un peu ce qui nous a permis de développer la stratégie nationale sur le logement et les consultations ici pour l'approche des droits axés sur le droit de la personne.
Alors, c'est un bon lien entre notre prochaine question. Dans une approche fondée sur les droits, à quel point l'État a l'obligation de fournir un logement aux itinérants? C'est une question non pas vraiment de fournir de logement, mais c'est toute une stratégie structure, n'est-ce pas?
Oui. Comme Adam a mentionné, c'est pas un droit au logement, c'est vraiment d'avoir le système qui permet aux Canadiens d'avoir une chance, d'avoir une qualité de vie. Et comme Adam a mentionné, le logement est très important, avoir une bonne qualité de vie. Donc, évidemment, dans un pays comme le Canada, on devrait envisionner ou visualiser un pays qui n'aura pas d'itinérance, parce qu'on est un pays qui est quand même considéré comme étant un pays riche au Canada. Donc, on veut développer le système qui un jour éliminerait l'itinérance au Canada.
It's very helpful.
Avec les femmes, avec l'expérience de l'itinérance, the women who experience homelessness in a very different way than men, and you can see that with the shelter numbers across the country, where it's predominantly men in shelters, but it means the hidden homeless are probably predominantly female. The inability to access good quality housing puts women in many situations across this country at risk, and so realizing their basic human rights, their good, strong housing policy is one of the objectives of this government. It's one of the things that gender-based analysis gives us as a budgeting process. It's one of the things that actually, quite frankly, grew the housing program as we proposed it going from election to government. And so how we realize those rights, how we make sure that we aren't not just dealing with the sort of the stereotypes around homelessness, or not just dealing with the simple price point of affordability, how we also make sure that populations in vulnerable settings get placed in better settings is part of the way we realize women's rights in the society. And in particular, women with children, because quite often children are the collateral damage when women's rights aren't fully realized. So the National Housing Strategy has to be responsive to this, and we're not going to get there without these consultations providing us input from those sorts of perspectives, which is why it's so critical that people with lived experience come forward and be heard in this process, and why it's also so critical that the other orders of government participate in this process.
That's terrific. Now, getting to something kind of practical, certainly everything you guys have just said is what I see on the ground as an affordable housing consultant in Toronto. There's tremendous need, and the systemic change piece, I think, will really help realize the reduction in the homelessness you were speaking about, Michel. So can you give us, our audience, a bit of a sense here? How long will these consultations last? I understand the period is between now and June, because we also want to get this moving. Your government's interested in legislating this, not just talking about it forever. So what can you tell us about the consultations?
So the consultations add on to other consultations. This is not a stop and a start date to a conversation about housing. So around the National Housing Strategy, there's been a couple of years of consultations. I've just completed with the Homeless Partnership Strategy reprofiling, a very focused conversation around homelessness. There's also been poverty reduction consultations, which have fed in and are continuing to feed into this process. But this particular process on the rights-based approach to a framework for the National Housing Strategy, we would like to get completed by June. And we've been informed by other perspectives through this process. For example, when we did a poverty reduction strategy here in Toronto that focused on anti-Black racism and the impact on African Canadians of poverty, housing came up as one of the ways in which their rights are not realized fully in our society. The racism and the discrimination they get as an access to housing is as critical as to providing housing in of itself. And so we need to hear from distinct population groups about distinct challenges they have accessing a housing system which is there to realize their full human rights. And again, this gets back into how the framework will provide context for the National Housing Strategy, but it will also make sure that all Canadians have access to a complete and a comprehensive housing system that meets particular community needs in the ways in which those communities experience core housing need.
We have one last question, and this one's just come in. For people who have no permanent home, will they be able to claim a right to housing? For instance, is it a right like access to water that can be demanded? That's an interesting one.
Well,
you sort of touched on the framework earlier.
The right to housing doesn't necessarily get you the right housing. And what the UN Convention says, and what our government's goal is to make it obvious as to how you realize your rights within a housing system. But it's not, what our government's trying to do is get you into a home, not a courthouse, to introduce you to a landlord, not a lawyer. This is not a constitutional argument that we're proposing here. What we're saying is, look, you cannot realize your full human rights unless you have a host of government services that support you. Healthcare is one of them, education is another one, and housing is part of that network of social policies that project human rights and protect people's human rights. But it's not a legal argument that you can say, I deserve this house because I live in this community, therefore I get a piece of property. That is a legalistic argument. What we're trying to do here is build real housing for real people and realize their real human rights.
Thank you. Michel, alors il s'agit vraiment d'un système et d'un processus systématique pour créer le logement abordable et ou garantir les droits, non seulement de créer, n'est-ce pas? Alors, on veut avoir est-ce que vous pouvez préciser un peu pour notre audience française exactement qu'est-ce que ça veut dire?
Oui, certainement. Comme Adam a mentionné, Si c'est un droit exécutoire, vraiment, les seules personnes que ça aide, c'est les avocats. Donc, les avocats vont être capables d'avoir des maisons parce qu'ils vont avoir beaucoup de législation. Donc, vraiment, c'est le système qu'on veut implémenter qui donne une chance à tous les Canadiens et qu'on ait un système aussi flexible qui s'adapte, que le gouvernement peut s'adapter aux différentes conditions à travers le pays. Donc, le Canada est un gros pays. Les situations ne sont pas pareilles de ville en ville et de régions rurales non plus. Donc, on veut vraiment un système adaptif qui est capable de donner une chance à tous les Canadiens d'avoir accès à un logement sûr et abordable.
Thank you. A chance to all Canadians. I like that. In either language, that sounds awfully good. Well, this is all the time we have today. Thank you very much for sending your questions, for listening, and we look forward to receiving your submissions. Certainly the government, and CMHC as the government's housing agency, are going to be very eager to see what comes in across the country over the next couple of months. So how do you contribute? You can send your ideas and comments online. Now in English, the website is www.placetocallhome.ca. La période de consultation sera ouverte jusqu'à juin, comme nous avons mentionné. Vous pouvez soumettre vos idées et commentaires via notre site internet www.chez-soi-d'abord, un mot unique, sans accent.ca. Chez-soi d'abord.ca. Gentlemen, thank you. Your insights have been excellent, and I really look forward to seeing what comes forward as we move to introduce Canada's national housing strategy.
Thank you.
Merci,
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.